Now, I don't know if you know this, but our late and wonderful Queen Mother, that's right, Queen Elizabeth, was obviously revered by so many people. But she too, as I've told you before here on the show, got a little bit starstruck from time to time. And one of her all-time favourite actors was a man that was sort of quintessentially British, but not really, because he wasn't actually born here in Britain at the time. That's just where his parents were stationed during army service. But what's fascinating about this particular story is he was encouraged to undertake this particular project, all thanks to a very brief chat with none other than the late Queen Mother. Yes, we're talking about a man that was debonair, some might say, of course, one of the best critics in the business. If I mention the name Addison DeWitt, you know exactly who I'm talking about. Maureen, lovely to see you. Thank you so much as ever for your time today. You all right? Not bad, thank you. Yes, it's starting to rain, so I know. We'll have a quick wave. Sorry, I know I'm slacking, aren't I? You all right? Not bad, thank you. And as ever, listen, thank you so much for supporting, as I say, everything I do. I really appreciate it. A lot of people do see me about, up and about now, filming, which is lovely when you come up and say hello. And they genuinely can't believe I'm just doing this on my own. But I do, I literally enjoy the process. And it's nice sharing all the stories with you. A woman said the other day in the comments, Neil, you can't remember all that. You must have a teleprompter. There's nothing here. Look, there's just me. There's no teleprompter on the phone. You can't get them anyway. I don't know why, but I never like a teleprompter. I like a conversation. Like we're talking naturally, I hate it when they put up the prompter in the studio. You think, not doing that. You can imagine what I'm like, can't you? And now, let's get back to your royal story of the day. Fascinating this, because he was one of my all-time favourite actors. A person, I would say, that very influential to so many people. We're talking about the brilliant actor, George Sanders. Now, when you think about George Sanders, he didn't really have the mega career, when you think. We remember him, of course, as Addison DeWitt in All About Eve. Big success, of course, for the actor. But what was fascinating about him was really deep down, although he enjoyed acting, he knew he was trapped basically playing baddies on screen, and he wanted to desperately move away from that, but didn't know how, this sort of thing. Now, where it gets even more interesting and more complicated is that when he was over here for a royal premiere, a Royal Command film premiere, in front of our late Queen Mother, no less, he pointed out that, in fact, he did start out originally as something of a band singer. Yes, he'd been on the London stage and he'd sort of sang with the big dance bands of the 1930s and said he had a wonderful voice. Well, apparently, she said, well, don't let that go. We'd love to hear something from you. Why don't you sing something, all that sort of stuff. And apparently when he got back to Hollywood, he was inspired. The problem was that George Sanders thought he was how shall we put it nicely, a Frank Sinatra. He wasn't really that. Pleasant voice, but certainly not going to crack any pots, you know what I mean? So there wasn't really the big rush to sign him for a mega deal, and he couldn't believe that himself. Finally, though, he managed to cut some demos in New York in a small studio. What he decided was, well, he was going to show the public anyway exactly what a talent he really was. And he managed, as I say, to get an album deal. This is in around about 57, 58. Now, his idea to sell the album was to none other than have a duet with his former co-star from All About Eve. No, not Bette Davis. No, Marilyn Monroe. But sadly, Marilyn, wisely, some people might suggest, found herself a little bit too busy and couldn't actually partake in a duet. Now, George didn't take this as a slight, because he said, well, look, let's try Jane Mansfield then, because he was also signed at the time to 20th Century Fox. Even the very publicity-hungry Jane Mansfield couldn't force herself on record. This left George really plundering away, wondering who he could actually team up with. So what he decided was, in order to get a share of the publishing, and more importantly, to make sure that he made some money, he would write a song as well to be included on the album. So there is a self-penned song. Now, the album came out and he duly sent copies over to all senior members of the British monarchy. Now, I'm not quite sure, genuinely, or exactly what they thought of this particular album, but George was absolutely thrilled with it. Couldn't believe, that he'd reached this point, but it wasn't particularly well received. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because he was looking to try and get a slot on one of the Royal Command performances, the Royal Variety performances, but they just wanted him to come on and introduce somebody. They didn't want him to sing. They said, people don't know you as a singer, it will confuse people. George thought, this is ridiculous. Once they hear me, the public will love me and the album will work. He had a lot of setbacks. It didn't work out. But as I often say here on the show, it's lovely to share these stories because this particular story was backed up by Robert Vaughan, no less, the good friend of mine that I became friendly with many years later. And he said this was George's biggest problem. He could not get away from playing sort of English baddies, and he really wanted to be in musicals, singing, dancing, all-star. But as Robert very nicely and tactfully said, he had a nice voice, but he certainly was no Frank Sinatra. According to George Sanders, though, he was. Now the album's become a collector's item, and if you have a copy of the original, it's certainly worth some money. But it's interesting to note that a very brief chat at a premiere with Queen Elizabeth at the time, well, set it all off. Sadly for George, though, seemingly even the Queen Elizabeth didn't necessarily, Sadly for George, though, even the, shall we say, push from the late Queen Elizabeth wasn't enough to push George to the top of the charts, something that irked him for the rest of his life. As many people know, sadly, George decided to take his own life, saying he was kind of bored and wanted to do something differently, as only you would expect from someone like Addison DeWitt. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.